Look, focus on the dot in the center. The other dots may disappear, then come back again, as if reality is flickering. But the screen is not. Of course, the dot didn't go anywhere. It was there the whole time. But for a few seconds it disappeared from your experience. And this is not just a fun experiment. It is the beginning of a crack in a very familiar certainty. That reality is simply sitting in front of us, ready, stable, complete, waiting to be seen. Your mind didn't ask for permission. It simply edited the visible world before you even had time to notice. But if your brain can remove something while you are looking directly at it, then the next question is, how much of your world has already been changed, removed, or filled in before you call it reality? This video is about how the mind builds the world you live in, and how inside that construction the person you call you begins to appear. Because from here on, this is no longer about a dot. This is about the moments when you were absolutely sure. I see what's happening. I remember how it was. I understand why I did that. I know what kind of person is in front of me. I know what is true. But what if, in those exact moments, your mind had already finished assembling the world, and you simply stepped inside and call it reality? And at the end, we are going to try to take all of this away. The quizzes, the quick explanation, the familiar feeling that the world already makes sense. And we'll see whether you could live even one ordinary day that way. Just getting up, recognizing the room, answering another person, understating that the day has even begun. My name is Kristen, and this is Identity in Fragments, a space for unfamiliar questions that stay with you. If it matters to you that conversation like this continue, you can support this channel here. You know what to do. And we continue. Because the dot is only the beginning and maybe the safest example in this entire video. After the disappearing dot, it's very easy to calm yourself down, to say, okay, that was an illusion, a teeny glitch in the system. For a second, the brain removed something and we simply caught it in the act. But that explanation is too safe, because the most unsettling part doesn't begin when perception breaks. It begins when perception is working normally. You simply look at the world and think, I'm seeing what's there. But no, you are not seeing what is there. You are seeing what the human body is even capable of turning into experience. And that is not a small adjustment. Because between reality and what you call reality, there is a body, an eye, an ear, skin, a nervous system, a brain, attention, memory, and only after all of those layers does something become, for you, color, sound, an event, time, a world. So you never meet reality directly. You meet it in translation. And that translation is so familiar that we mistake it for the world itself. But imagine a flower, an ordinary flower. To you it may be yellow, white, beautiful, readable. But for a bee, that same flower may contain ultraviolet patterns that don't exist for us in the visible world. Not because they are mystically hidden, but because human vision doesn't make them part of the picture. For another living being, this may not be just a flower. It may be a map, a direction, a signal, a path to the center. The same object, the same surface, the same light, but not the same world. And the flower is only the beginning. For bats, part of the world is built through ultrasound, for snakes, through heat, for sharks and rays, through electrical fields, for migratory birds, through Earth's magnetic fields. This is not a list of nature's superpowers. It's a more uncomfortable thought. Access to the world depends on the structure of the one gaining access, and none of them receives reality as a whole. Each one receives a working version of the world, built for its body, its way of surviving. And humans are no exception. Even within human perception, the world is not assembled the same way for everyone. Some people cannot distinguish shadows that are obvious to someone else, and for some people, letters, numbers, or sounds automatically evoke color, shape, or a sense of space. This is called synesthesia, and it's not fantasy, not metaphor. For a person with synesthesia, it's a stable way experience is assembled. So even within one space, the world doesn't arrive in the same form for everyone. And then the question becomes more precise. Why did we ever assume that normal human perception is the baseline version of reality? The world for the bee, the world for the bat, the world for the snake, the world for the bird, the world for the human. And this is not a philosophical game. It means that every organism doesn't simply have a body inside the world. It has its own way of making the world accessible. And this translation doesn't only apply to what we see, hear, or feel through the skin. Even time, the thing that feels like the smoothest, most natural background of life, doesn't come to us as a clean line. We say an hour passed, a minute passed, a year passed. But even physically, time is not that simple. In physics, this is not a poetic idea. After Einstein, time can no longer be treated as an absolute background. At the level of precise measurement, time is not an absolute backdrop, but part of the structure of the world. In ordinary human life, time is not linear either. Sometimes an hour disappears almost without a trace, and 1 minute stays with you for years. You know this. A day can pass as if it was barely there. You got up, you drove somewhere, you rapped, you talked, you did things, moved from room to room. But in the evening, when you try to remember the day, there is almost nothing there. Not because time sped up, but because consciousness had almost nothing to hold on to. The brain didn't mark its an event, didn't place a tag, didn't say, come back here, this matters, keep this. And sometimes the opposite happens. A few seconds become enormous. One sentence, one look, one phone call, one moment, after which the air seems to change density. You are still standing in the same room. The clocks are moving as usual, but inside, time is no longer ordinary. As if the brain suddenly increases the resolution of these one fragments of life. Remember this. This can change everything. We will come back here. And you do come back, sometimes for years, not because that moment was objectively longer, but because your experience made it longer. And this is the same principle again. Reality doesn't simply enter us. It is encoded, marked, compressed, sometimes discarded, sometimes enlarged until it becomes an entire chapter of a life. And here another important layer appears. In perception research, there is a concept called postdiction. If prediction is when the brain tries to predict what will happen next, then postdiction is when the brain uses what happened immediately after an event to assemble how that event will be experienced. One interpretation of this effect is prediction. The idea that the brain uses information arriving just after an event to construct the perception of what just happened. So the brain doesn't simply record the frame. It takes a teeny slice of time after the event, looks at what happened next, and only then assembles the feeling of what seemed to be given to you as now. That is why the present doesn't always arrive as a finished frame. Sometimes it's slightly processed, synchronized, filled in, assembled so the world doesn't fall apart into separate flashes, movements, sounds, and delays. And if human experience is only a slice of reality, only a translation, only a usable version of the world, then what happens inside the translation itself? Look at this room. You don't know anything about it yet, but most likely some kind of impression has already appeared. But where did that come from? You only saw a space. Light, traces, things someone chose, things someone left behind. And your brain has already started building. Not just a room, but a character, a mood, a presence. And all of it has already collapsed into one feeling, atmosphere, as if atmosphere were a thing hanging in the air. But maybe there is no separate thing called atmosphere there at all. Maybe your brain just did what it does all the time. It took too many signals too quickly, too densely, and compressed them into a single experience. Not a list of details, not a report, a feeling. And that feeling appeared so fast that it started to feel like reality. This is where the next level begins. Not just we only see the human slice of the world, something more difficult, even inside that slice. The brain doesn't show you everything. It doesn't give you reality as raw material. It gives you a scene that has already been assembled. And most of the time, that assembly is exactly what we call I see what's happening. Now look at the screen. There are many faces here. Don't try to memorize each one. Look at what impression they leave behind. Did you catch it? Now look at this. This is not a person from that image, and it's not the correct answer. It's more like an attempt to turn that first impression into one face. Does it match? If you won't tell me later whether it did, I'm honestly curious what stayed with you after those 40 faces. Because for me, if I'm being honest, it matched almost uncomfortably well. Now the question is, did you really read every face? Or did your brain do something faster? In perception research, there is a concept called ensemble perception. The perception of an ensemble or the summary statistics of a scene. For example, Jason Haberman and David Whitney showed that people can quickly extract the average emotion of a group of faces, even when they can't accurately say which specific faces were in that group. Not as a precise reading of every person, more like a fast summary. And this is a very human thing. The brain doesn't always ask, what is here individually? Sometimes it asks, what is here on average? And suddenly the crowd feels angry. the room feels tense. Before you can even explain why, there is a use for this. You can't break the world down pixel by pixel every time. If the brain demanded a full wrapper, you would still be stuck at the doorway. Life doesn't give you that much time, so the brain takes a shortcut. It says, here is the overall tone, start from there. But that speed has a price. Because the average can hide the difference. Some people were sad, others were tired, others were happy, some were just staring into space. But inside you, all of it has already become one unfiled feeling. And you're not reaching to each person. You're reacting to a compressed version of the scene, to statistics that feel like fact. And maybe that's why we trust first impressions so often, not because they are always right, but because they arrive before doubt does. But the brain doesn't only compress space, it also smooths time. You look at what's in front of you right now, and it seems like this is a clean moment, this face, this look. But perception rarely starts from zero. It carries with it a trace of the previous moment. In research, this is called serial dependence, a sequential dependence in perception. In simpler terms, what you just saw can slightly shift what you see now. You just read an alarming news story, and an ordinary sound outside already feels like a signal. You were just in a rush, and the slow person in front of you no longer feels slow, but obstructive. You just felt unwanted, and a delayed reply already sounds like distance. As if the present doesn't arrive alone, it arrives with inertia. And that makes sense. If every moment were completely new, the world would be unbearably fragmented. Every glance a new task, every sound a new signal, every movement a separate universe. The brain protects us from this. It assumes that the world in the next second will be somewhat like the world in the previous one. That's how reality doesn't fall apart into pieces. But sometimes, this same mechanism makes the present less pure. You think I'm reacting to what is happening, but maybe you're reacting to what is happening through the trace of what just happened. And then the question becomes quieter, but more unpleasant. How many times have you called something intuition when it was really just the result of the previous moment? And now, a different kind of editing. Not fast, very slow. So slow it almost doesn't look like an event, more like a series of teeny shifts, each one still close enough to be accepted as normal. And as long as the next moment is similar enough to the one before it, the brain accepts it. And then you see the before and the after. In research, this is connected to change blindness. Ronald Rensing describes it as a situation where a person doesn't experience a visual change, even though once it is detected, it can be easily visible. In other words, the problem is not that the change is impossible to see. The problem is that it never enters conscious experience. But what's especially strange is something else. Daniel Simons, Stephen Frank Connery, and Rebecca Raymer showed that change blindness can happen even without a sudden visual disruption if the change happens gradually. And this is where it becomes more than just an effect about pictures, because the most important thing in life often change exactly this way. Not like an explosion, but like a series of teeny, almost the same. One kind of order becomes familiar, one tone of conversation settles in, one new reaction repeats more often, and all of it is too similar to yesterday to look like an event. And then suddenly it feels strange, not because everything changed in the moment, but because you finally saw the distance. You don't meet the moment. There may not have been a moment. You miss the transformation. And this is one of the quietest mechanisms of consciousness. The brain preserves continuity, so the world doesn't break every second, but sometimes that very continuity hides from us what has already stopped being the same. And there is one more thing. Sometimes the world doesn't change at all. Only the version of the world the brain is already prepared to see changes. First, look at this image. Not the main one, the preparatory one. Stay with it for a couple of seconds, and now another image. This one is already ambiguous. You can see one figure in it, or a completely different one. But if the brain has just been tuned to the first version, it's more likely to start assembling this image in the same direction. Not because the image changed, it's the same image. What's changed is the frame the brain brought to it. In 2010, Paula Gulpasian and Courtney Woodbury studied priming effects with ambiguous figures. They showed participants cues, image or words connected to one of the possible interpretations. Then participants saw an ambiguous image, and the earlier cue could influence which version they choose. In other words, the brain doesn't just look, it arrives at the image already slightly prepared. It's that the first meaning can open one path and close another. If a short message comes late from someone you trust, you think, busy. If the same message comes late from someone you are afraid to lose, you think, that's it. The same signal, a different reality, not because you made it all up, but because the brain rarely leaves the world completely open. It assembles it into a form, and then new information starts entering through that form. So the present doesn't come to us raw. It has already been compressed, smoothed, pulled toward what happened a second ago, and assembled it into the form the brain managed to choose first. And only then do we call it, I see what's happening. But if even now has already been assembled, what happens to the past? The past feels more reliable than the present. It already happened. It's already behind you, as if you could open it, rewind it, and watch it one more time. This is exactly how it was. But there is no file like that in your head. No perfect recording of every day, no archive where the real past is stored. There are fragments, images, smells, sentences, and mood. What you understood then, and what you only understood later. And when you remember, your brain doesn't simply retrieve the past. It builds the scene again. Not from nothing, but not from a clean recording either. Bartlett showed this a long time ago. When people remember a story, they don't reproduce it word for word. They shorten it, simplify it, make it more understandable, pull it closer to what they already know. So memory is not storage, it's reconstruction. I explored this separately in my video I Miss Me, where we talk about nostalgia, the past, and the version of yourself you can miss. But here something else matters. Memory doesn't just show you the past, it creates a place you can enter again. A house, a room, a conversation, someone's voice, that exact moment. And in that sense, memory is strangely close to imagination. When you remember the past, your brain builds an inner scene. When you imagine the future, it also builds an inner scene, just from different fragments. From past experience, from expectation, from fear, from desire, from what had once already been possible. And this is where memory becomes something more than a way to look backward. It helps you feel that your life has continuity. That yesterday is you, today is you, and the one who once had no idea what would happen next are not just different states. They are one story. Not because that story was already written, but because memory can connect fragments until they begin to feel like, this is my life. And that is why the same moment can change over the years. Back then, you might have thought, I just stayed silent. Later, I was scared. Even later, I already understood everything then. I just didn't have the words for it yet. The event seems to be the same, but the person remembering it is already different. And because of that, it isn't only the memory of the event that changed. Its role in your biography changed too. What used to seem like an accident becomes a sign. What felt like a pause becomes a beginning. What looked like weakness becomes evidence. I already felt something then, and the past starts to look as if it had always been leading here, as if life had been a line, but maybe the line appeared later. Maybe biography is not something you find in memory. Maybe it's something memory builds out of fragments, connections, and meaning, until it feels like, that was me. And then a question appears. If memory builds the past, if it connects scattered moment into a story called my life, then who explains later why you did what you did? You can look directly at what is happening and still miss the most important thing. In one experiment, Daniel Simons and Daniel Levin created a very simple situation. A stranger walks up to someone on the street and asks for directions. The person starts explaining where to turn, where to walk, how to find the place, and then people carrying a large door walk between them. For a second, the door blocks part of the scene. The conversation continues. Same situation, same task, same role. And here is the uncomfortable part. In this experiment, some participants didn't notice that while the door passed between them, the person in front of them has been replaced. Not a different detail in the background, not a different object, a different conversation partner, the person they had just been talking to. And this is not just people don't pay attention. Something more precise becomes visible here. Sometimes the brain holds on not to the person, but to the structure of the situation. If the scene doesn't break, consciousness may not notice the rupture. Not because nothing changed, but because the story still looks continuous. You thought you were seeing a person, but maybe your brain was only holding on to a role. But that is only the first layer, because consciousness can do more than miss a rupture. It can explain it, as if the rupture was never there. In the work of Peter Johnson and his colleagues, there is a phenomenon called choice blindness. In one of the experiments, participants were shown two photographs of faces and asked to choose which face they found more attractive. The person chose. After that, they were shown a photograph and asked to explain, why this one? But sometimes the researchers secretly switched their card. The person had chosen one face, but was now explaining another. And many people didn't notice the switch. They would say, I like the smile, the expressions in the eyes, some kind of softness, some feeling of openness. The explanation sounded confident, as if the person really had access to the reason behind their choice. But the problem is, they were explaining a choice they hadn't made. And the most important thing here is not that the person made a mistake. It is how quickly consciousness restored coherence. Because inside ourselves, we don't want to feel a rupture. I choose, but I don't know why. I said it, but I don't understand where it came from. I did it, and the reason only appeared afterward. That is too uncomfortable. So consciousness fills it in. There is another example, rarer and cheaper. In studies of people with split brain, where the connections between the two hemispheres had been surgically severed, Michael Gazzaniga described the work of that he called the interpreter. In those studies, information could influence an action without being available to verbal explanation. But when the person was asked why they had done one thing or another, they could still give an explanation, not because they wanted to deceive anyone, but because consciousness was trying to build a coherent story out of what was available to it. Split brain is not proof that everyone works exactly like this. It's a rare neurological window. But through that window, we can see a principle that appears in softer forms in ordinary life. Consciousness doesn't always know the cause, but it almost always wants an explanation, because explanation makes experience livable. Without it, life would be too fragmented. An event, an impulse, a reaction, a random sentence, a choice you don't fully understand, a stranger's face changed behind a door. Too many ruptures, not enough line. Consciousness doesn't like ruptures. If it doesn't know the cause, it may create one. But if it explains ourselves this way, what happens when it starts explaining other people? Their silence, their sharpness, their mistakes, their intentions. What happens when the mind builds not only the event, but the meaning of the person in front of you? You think you're reacting to a fact, but maybe you're reacting to the meaning your brain has already managed to place inside it. The message didn't come. The sentence sounded dry. Someone was late. Someone stayed silent. On their own, those are not answers yet. But the brain almost immediately starts building a version. They're avoiding me. They don't respect me. She doesn't care. He doesn't care. And most of the time, we don't feel that we're building an interpretation. We feel that we're seeing the truth. The mind doesn't only build the scene, not only the past, not only the explanation. It builds meaning. In social psychology, there is a concept called the fundamental attribution error. It is associated with the work of Leros and other researchers. The idea is that we often explain persons' behavior through their character rather than through the situation they were in. She said it sharply, so she's arrogant. He's silent, so he's cold. She made a mistake, so she's irresponsible. But what about the situation? Exhaustion, fear, pressure, lack of sleep, shame, a context we cannot see. But the brain likes the shortcut. A person as a trait is simpler than a person as a situation in motion. And this is not just bad thinking. It's a fast way to navigate social reality. But here too, speed has a price. The first version of a person can become the frame for everything you see afterward. If someone first seemed cold, their silence confirms the coldness. If they first seem deep, the same silence becomes mystery. One signal, two realities, not because the world changed, but because the meaning was built differently. And this doesn't only apply to people. Sometimes the brain builds a feeling of truth where there is only familiarity. In research, this is called the illusory true effect. Back in the 1970s, Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Tappino showed that repeated statements can seem more true than new ones. Not because repetition proves anything, but because the familiar is easier to process. The brain doesn't necessarily say, "This is true." It may say something quieter. "I've heard this somewhere before," and sometimes that feeling of familiarity is mistaken for reliability. That is why a phrase repeated many times can start to sound almost natural. Not proven, natural, as if it already belongs to the world. And now it becomes clearer what exactly the mind is built in. Behavior becomes character. Repetition becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes plausibility. And all of this happens so fast that it feels like I'm simply seeing things as they are. But maybe as they are is already an assembled version, not necessarily false, but built. Meaning makes the world human, but that is exactly why meaning can become dangerous, because built meaning starts to look like discovered truth. You think, "I understood this person," but maybe you understood the story your mind had already built about them. You think, "This is abuse," but maybe it has simply become familiar. And if the mind builds the visible world, the past, causes, and meaning, what would be left if you tried to remove all of that assembly, leave only the facts, only accuracy, only reality? I promise, this is where it gets interesting. Imagine you wake up in the morning, and this time the world doesn't assemble itself. You open your eyes, but morning in my room doesn't appear. Because a room is not just walls around you. A room is memory, recognition, habit, a sense of place, the quiet knowledge, I've been here before. This is my home. I can exist here. Without that assembly, there is only a stream. Light, shadows, surface, the pressure of fabric on your skin, the position of your body, sounds, internal signals from the body, everything at once. You haven't even started the day yet. You only opened your eyes, and already there is too much. Now try to get up. But just getting up is a luxurious simplification. In reality, you have to account for where the edge of the bed is, how far the floor is, where to place your foot, how to shift your weight, how to keep your balance, how your body will behave in the next half second. Usually, the brain throws all of this out of your consciousness, and it's right to do so, because if it doesn't, you will get stuck trying to leave the bed. Let's say by some miracle you do manage to stand up. Great, you defeated the bed. Now try going out into the world. Usually the brain immediately assembles road, people, cars, traffic light, danger, safe to cross. But now that is gone. There is noise, speed, faces, distance, movement, signals. How will you cross the street if every step requires calculation again? The speed of the car, the length of your step, the asphalt, the traffic light, the interior of your body, the driver's mistake, your mistake. You wanted fewer assumptions. Now you have more data and less chance of moving at all. And now people. And this is worse than the road, because at least the car moves along a trajectory. A person doesn't. There is a face in front of you, but a familiar face doesn't appear on its own. That has to be assembled. Futures, memories, previous meetings, and name and role their relation to you. Without this, you don't meet someone you know. You meet a set of signs that may have appeared somewhere before. The person says hello, but hello is not just a sound. It is who is speaking, how they are speaking, why now, whether you can relax, whether you need to respond, whether this is warmth, politeness, obligation, treat, an ordinary sin, or something wrong. Usually the brain assembles this instantly, but without assembly, the person in front of you doesn't become a conversation partner. They become a task you have to decode by hand. The conversation doesn't wait. And you're still trying to understand who exactly you are seeing. Let's say you survive until the end of the day. What was it? Where will you place this day? What will it become? A story, an experience, the feeling that something happened to me today? Or will it remain only a scattering? Glare, pressure, tone of voice, contours, pose, noise, movement, pauses. Too much data and not a single day. You simply find yourself inside it without a map, without connection, and without the slightest idea what to do with all of it now. And now we return to where we started, to the dot that never disappeared from the screen. It was there. For a few seconds, it simply wasn't in your world, not in the world itself, in yours. And maybe this is a world shift. Because the all must never fail. My mind is assembling reality right now. We feel something else. I see. I remember. I understand. I know what happened. I know why I acted that way. I know what kind of person is in front of me. But between what exists and what becomes your experience, something always happens. Something is selected, Something is compressed, something is filled in, something is connected to the past, something is given meaning. And only then do you enter an already assembled world and call it reality. Not because you were wrong, not because the brain is broken, but because without this assembly the world would be too large, too fast, too raw. You wouldn't be able to simply get up, recognize a face, answer hello, gather the past into a biography, gather yourself into someone who continues through time. The mind doesn't simply show you the world, it makes the world usable for your presence inside it. But that is exactly why the strongest version of reality is the one you no longer notice as a version. It simply becomes, well, that's obvious. He's cold. I've always been like this. This always happens to me. And maybe the main question is not how to see reality without filters. We are always looking from somewhere. From a body, from memory, from language, from fear, from experience, from the version of ourselves that has managed to assemble by this moment. But sometimes you can notice, this is not all of reality. This is my current assembly. And in that small gap, a pause appears. Before the first impression becomes a fact, before an old fear becomes intuition, before the familiar story becomes you again. Maybe we cannot step outside constructed reality, but sometimes we can notice the construction, not destroy it, not tear away every filter, not see the world absolutely clean, just notice. I'm already inside a version, and that means another one is possible.